ladies and gentlemen, next to take to the rostrum, Mr. Regan Chester Callender, ESG and Sustainability Professional, experienced in providing support to both startups and corporates across all ESG components. Beginning his career working for a sustainable manufacturing startup, Mr. Callender's diverse skill set was utilised to grow partnerships within EMEA markets and to guide operations to increase fundraising potential. Please welcome Mr. Regan Chester Callender.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Global Safety Summit, giving insights into ESG. That was quite the introduction, so I won't introduce myself too much more and get straight into it. So I'd like to thank Annabelle for an excellent speech and everyone who preceded me. And I think this giving rise to these sorts of events where ESG can take the spotlight, and there can be different perceptions and different understandings of ESG as a complex and also relatively infant term and component. I think that's really important because I think it can be very difficult for businesses, individuals, but also governments to understand ESG for what it is and also to know how to address it. So looking at the future of ESG, trends and predictions, and trying to predict the future, I'm going to look at it from a perspective of some of the trends which exist, some of the predictions which I personally would like to see and I think are likely, potentially utopian, but I like to see them as just mildly optimistic. I think there's a lot of collaboration internationally which can make this happen. And so I'd like to outline a few of those and also do something which is potentially uncommon within these buildings and try and answer a few questions. So the questions that I'll try to answer is, where has ESG come to this point? What's given rise to ESG to where we are now? And I won't focus on that too much because we want to continue into the future. And so then I'll look at what does ESG look like in the future. So let's give the game away a little bit in terms of my view of ESG. So I'm going to speak about the common trends, but also the way I see it is growth. And I think that's plain to see. ESG shall continue to grow. And I think the way that it will grow will encounter some risks. And for individuals, for companies, for governments, for everyone involved, those risks will have to be mitigated. And I will talk a little bit around how I think they can be mitigated a little bit later on. But also, fundamentally, without giving the conclusion away too early, I think ESG is becoming, or has become, such an integral part of business models and a future measure of success that ESG growth is fundamental to corporate growth and finance growth, as Annabelle very eloquently delivered. So, considering the rise of ESG until now, what's changed? So in the last few years, the definitions have become clearer. 10, 15 years ago, many of us in this room wouldn't have understood ESG in its comparative terms, and I think having to define it would have been a very difficult task even for myself. That has come from and led to the adaptation of ESG departments, of sustainability departments within businesses. And I think that relationship of one informing the other has really led to the growth of ESG as a premise. Things like commitment to science-based targets initiatives, targets towards net zero, as well as social value chain models of disclosure are a couple of examples of how ESG over the last few years, and I'm certain in the next few years, has become a stalemate of accountability and a measure of accountability towards businesses. And businesses are open and up for making themselves accountable. I think that's where the real transition has been in the last few years. As we've come to where we are now, in 2024, global sustainable investment surpassed $30 trillion in 2024. Now that's an uptake of 68% compared with 2014. So there is a real drive towards ESG, and I think that some of the future and some of the trends and predictions and the benefits that hopefully I'll come on to in a second will really inform on why that's been the case. 90% of the S&P 500 companies now disclose an ESG report. It's a hugely prevalent element of huge importance globally, and I think companies are ready to make themselves accountable and ready to really endorse their ESG elements within their business. So it means different things to different businesses, but I think there are lots of trends which can affect businesses differently. Every business has their niche, whether you're an SME, whether you're a corporate. I've been lucky enough to have worked in a couple of SMEs and then with corporates as well, and I can tell you it's vastly different. For an SME, you're expected to do everything. For a corporate, you're also expected to do everything, but you're not recognised for it. So where do I see ESG trends going? I think fundamentally, regulation will increase and expand to supply chains, expand across mandatory disclosures. Businesses are making the decision to make themselves more accountable by reporting against international frameworks such as CDP, making it easy for people to understand a business's performance through their CDP score and for there to be mutual understanding across peer groups. The Global Reporting Initiative is another example of an international framework which businesses are making themselves accountable towards. So regulatory compliance will increase. Stakeholder pressure will also force businesses to focus around ESG criteria. And I think this is a really crucial one. Internal, external stakeholders, large and small, I think are pushing and have been pushing over the last few years really to force businesses to think about this. What's important to individuals, whether that's a customer, whether that's an internal stakeholder, an employee, whether that's an investor, what's important to them? I'll tell you what's important to them. A business's net zero commitments, their commitment to reducing their environmental impact, or negative impact, I should say. But also diversity in teams and progression. Diversity of thought is something that I'm sure we can all champion and should be championed. But also social impact. And I think one of the newer ones, which Simplify very eloquently delivered, and I think Eloise before them. Also, biodiversity reporting. We've surpassed the element where we're just looking at carbon reporting, and we've surpassed that, and I'm glad that we have, because it's meant that people are behind it. And now we're looking at, okay, what's our actual impact on the environment around us? Rather than looking at these figures and these carbon figures that everyone is so fixated on, how do we look at the habitats? How do we look at water scarcity? How do we look at these biodiversity elements which are so important for how people feel about the world around us? I think that's a really encouraging step. Also, ESG will grow through investment and become a value model for investors. And this is something that I'm really, really passionate about and will speak a lot about. So I think ESG will almost become, and almost has become, synonymous with value. Future value and future-proofing your business, whether that be physical environmental risks, whether they appear now, and if they don't appear now, we can be certain that they will appear in the future unless there's drastic action that's taken. But also diversity of thought in a growing multicultural world where collaboration across different cultures and languages and businesses and globalization and the intertwining of economies is more profound. And also then the long-term impact on communities. How are businesses interacting in their local community, and how does that have a value on the longevity of that business? Technological advances will then make reporting easier and create unity in disclosure. Companies like Simplify and other businesses helping companies to understand and helping them to do that in a way which is understood across all stakeholders will create unity in disclosure and also build understanding. And as I mentioned, biodiversity reporting, I imagine, will become the norm because of its innate value of nature and the world around us. So with that, sadly, it can't all be plain sailing. There are some risks. And some of the risks that I was thinking about when I was thinking of coming to, or when I was planning to come to talk this evening, was what do we see the risks as being? And I think one of the main ones is a potential dilution of standards as ESG increases in value. Across these international frameworks and across these standards organisations, reporting frameworks, standard organisations must remain consistent in what they're doing and avoid reducing their integrity for financial gain. Without naming names, I think there have been instances within the last few years of international standards and international regulations faltering slightly to the corporate agenda. And I don't think that that's a position that we can take. As an industry, we have to remain consistent because deviating from that will make us the laughingstock of the international framework. Also, I think with the growth of these regulations and the growth of these disclosure standards, also ESG may revert to a tick box exercise of agreed principles without the underlying sentiment. And I think sentiment is a really key word there, because the reason why we all care about ESG and the reason why we go into ESG careers is because of love for nature, love for the world, love for our children and wanting to create a better and harmonised society for them, love for our bodies and how we interact with them. And I think understanding how we can disclose our performance is important, and disclose to a certain standard is definitely important, but also let's have that creativity that was the reason we all went into ESG to come out, because without that it becomes a very dull and humdrum tick boxing exercise and progress will be stilted. I think a lack of international cooperation will also stifle progress. The US elections are currently running, and I think we obviously have a big divide there. On the one hand, we have someone who is a sustainability and an environmental impact denier. On the other hand, we have someone who might be a moderate, but also whose party will push an agenda of ESG and sustainability more so. And I think it's important that in choosing leadership across the globe, we think about ESG as a proponent of what sort of world we want to live in over the next few years. Brexit, for example, it's on our shores. The UK moving out of Europe has meant that although we might find a way to emulate CSRD and that mandatory disclosure and the innate benefit of what that disclosure framework helps businesses to do, personally, I believe that a wider community and more collaboration with more people breeds progress. And so I think that's something to be concerned of. So those are the trends as they may seem across the industry. And now I'm going to close with my perspective. So personally, I believe the goal of ESG should be for its momentum to take it to a place where ESG principles become dissolved within a business's strategy and business model. And I will use the term dissolved purposefully because I think they are still there, but we can't see them. Morgan Freeman once said, the way to get rid of racism is to stop talking about it. And I take a similar approach to ESG. It should not be this external component which is siloed and thought of separately to business functions and how we look at growing businesses or adapting to different risk factors, but woven into the fabric of each business as a value model itself and as something which can push the business forward. Thank you very much for listening.